Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus upon a recent United Nations report, a very interesting report on global population growth and sustainable development. My guest today is an expert on this report and many other aspects of it. My guest is Mr. John Wilmoth. Mr. Wilmoth, a U.S. national, is the director of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs Population Division at the United Nations. John Wilmoth, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Bill, it's good to be back with you.
Yes, it's been way too long. You do such great work, and we've not had a chance to get together for over 2 years now. But John, before we get into your report, just very briefly, what is DESA, the Department for Economic and Social Affairs? I know we could do a whole show on that, but in 2 or 3 sentences, what is its main purpose?
Well, the main purpose, there are 3 lines of work. We do an analysis of economic and social trends, and we support intergovernmental discussions on those topics and in the General Assembly and in the Economic and Social Council and the various subsidiary bodies thereof. And we also do capacity development work to support developing countries to develop the skills that are needed so that they can do this kind of work on their own. So it's across those 3 areas, all related to economic and social development, exactly, and relations also to the environment.
Yes, most assuredly. And our viewers can go to this website. We'll put it in the lower thirds, www.un.org/development/DESA/PD. And we will put that in the lower thirds. But for the moment, let's jump right into your major report on global population growth and sustainable development. And as I understand it, it was a report that probed the linkages between global population growth and the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Those are all so important to us, and we're living it every day. Let's go right into some of the findings. How is this rapid population growth developing, and how is that a common fixture of the demographic transition?
Well, Bill, you know, we are in an era of growth. Historically, this is a unique period of human history. It began a couple hundred years ago in some parts of the world, Northwestern Europe and North America, which began their demographic transition around that time. And that set off a period of growth, and that growth continues. And on a global scale, the demographic transition really took off around the middle of the last century, the middle of the 20th century, and is continuing today. And as a result, many countries are still growing rapidly. But you know, the basic idea of the demographic transition, it's basically a transition towards longer life and smaller families. And so these are really defining features of the modern world. And we've observed it all across the world. It's kind of a universal phenomenon. People are living longer and they're having fewer children. But in between, you know, what happens first is that people live longer, and that causes the population to grow. And then later they start to have fewer children. So it's the period in between that, between the decline of mortality and the eventual decline of fertility, that is the period of growth. And so we are really in this era of growth that began around 1800 in some parts of the world and in the middle of the 20th century on a global scale. And it will continue through the end of this century till about 2100. And by then we expect that the human population will stop growing in size by sometime around the end of the century.
Mm-hmm. And for years, I've been using a statistic, maybe your office put it out a few years ago, I'm not sure, but it said that by 2050, we'll have about 9.5 billion people on the planet. Is that correct? Is that first off, is that accurate? Secondly, what are we projecting, say, by 2050?
Right. So currently the human population is around 7.9 billion, and we expect that it will grow to around 8.5 billion by 2030, and then around 9.5 billion by 2050, and then to almost 11 billion by the end of the century. So, and the first parts of that are pretty secure. I mean, we can be fairly confident that indeed growth will continue along those lines through 2030, through 2050. In a time scale of around 30 or 40 years, population projections are very accurate. Beyond that, you know, there's more uncertainty because you have several generations in between, and you can't know for sure what's going to happen that far into the future. But overall, population projections are one of the most accurate things in terms of forecasting the future.
You're absolutely right there, especially as we've seen with wars, tragic wars that are taking place right now, and with pandemics, and that one just never knows how we're going to be affected by some of these external factors. First off, will most of the population growth be in economically developing countries, or where will it be?
It will be concentrated in less developed countries, in particular among the least developed countries. It's a group of about 50 countries identified by the UN as having special needs for development, who've had slow progress in development, and those countries are expected roughly to double in size between 2020 and 2050. So, and that will account for most of the world's growth over that time period as well. So yes, it's very clearly the low-income countries and the lower middle-income countries that are growing the most rapidly at this point. It's not the high-income countries like the United States and Europe and a few others.
Exactly. Now, is rapid population growth viewed as both a cause and a consequence of slow progress in development, or how do those factors interact with each other?
Well, yes, it's a complex relationship. It's clear that development affects population growth and population growth affects development. But often it's seen as a cause of slow development, slow progress in development, because of the fact that it adds an extra challenge to countries that are relatively poor and underdeveloped. And as they're trying to develop, of course, they need to increase the per capita investment in education and health. Everything that they spend money, every place where they spend money on the population, especially on children and helping to make those children into productive adults, wherever money is spent on that, they need to increase the per capita allocation. But when the population is growing at 3% per year, for example, that means they have to increase, they have to keep running just to keep up. It makes it that much more difficult than to increase the per capita investment in the development of the population and development of human capital. So it's in some ways a cause of slow progress in development, but it's also a symptom. And that we say that because in countries where populations are growing rapidly, typically these are countries where education levels are relatively low, health levels are not as high as we would like for them to be, and often women's position in society is such that there are not a lot of options for them, all of those factors really are in some ways the cause of the high fertility and the continuing population growth. And so we try to emphasize that it's most important to address those underlying causes, lack of health care, lack of access to family planning, low levels of education, especially for women, and in general, gender inequality and lack of empowerment for women and girls. And by addressing those issues, we've seen that in most countries of the world, when progress is made in those areas, the fertility rate tends to come down and population growth slows. It's part of a natural process of development, really. As countries develop socially and economically, the decline of fertility comes naturally with that.
Is it safe to say, and it sounds like it's a bit of both, that the rapid population growth is both a sign of success and a challenge to be met? It's not one or the other, but it's a combination of the two of them.
It's definitely a sign of success in the sense that, as I was saying earlier, it's brought on by the fact that we have successfully increased the human lifespan. The average, the average length of life has gone up, and even the maximum ages to which people survive, that has been going up slowly over time as well. And it's that increase in survival that causes population growth. Then the only thing that can bring it down is to reduce the birth rate so that the birth rate comes back into balance with the death rate. And that usually happens eventually. But so the first part of it, yes, it's definitely a success. It's a sign. It's one of the greatest successes of human history, I think, is the lengthening of the human lifespan, and that is what has brought this growth. So in some ways, it's a very positive thing, but at the same time, it brings challenges. Clearly, for countries that are underdeveloped and that are growing very rapidly, that presents a challenge, as I was mentioning earlier. And furthermore, we know that the total human economic activity and the total human consumption on this planet is having impacts on the environment, on the global environment, at a scale that was really never imagined. We never imagined that humans could have such an impact on, say, the global atmosphere. But now we know, for the past several decades, we've known that this is happening. And so there's an impact of but it's not just the size of the human population, it's really the size of the total consumption, the total activity of humans that matters.
And you're absolutely correct. We've seen this. We've had warnings, well, I guess since at least, well, before this, but definitely since 1988 with the creation of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has produced, I think, about 6 major studies promoting or discussing how humans have had such an impact on the planet and on the atmosphere and on really heating of the planet. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer and you like our show and you'd like to share it, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking with Mr. John Wilmoth, who is the director of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs Population Division at the United Nations, on a recent report that his office did titled Global Population Growth and Sustainable Development. John, there were so many items that came out in our previous 15 minutes, but when you were talking, every time, it seems like every other sentence, I started thinking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were created by the United Nations. I guess they came online in 2015 and run from 2016 to 2030. These are they all tie into what you're doing, but how important were they when you were laying out your facts or coming up with the research findings and that type of thing? But how important were the Sustainable Development Goals in developing your research, and how are we on track today, or are we still on track to achieve many of them by 2030, given we've had wars, we've had a pandemic, and those types of things?
Well, that's a very big question, Bill. I can answer the first part as far as how were we thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals when we prepared this report. Well, in fact, we looked very closely at them, and we tried to think about how to frame this topic in light of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We tried to think about what the connections were between population growth and each of the goals. And so you'll see that several chapters of the report very clearly kind of link to those goals and to the overarching theme of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is leaving no one behind. And so there's a chapter on leaving no one behind. For example, there's another chapter on poverty and inequality in relation to population growth, another one on hunger and food security and nutrition, another one on health and well-being, and another one on education, this one on. And for those who know the SDGs, I know that I've just cited goals 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are in some ways the human core of the SDGs, those that are really focused on human well-being directly measured in terms of poverty and hunger and health and education and gender equality. So there are very close connections to the SDGs, but we also looked closely at the environmental aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals and tried to say something about the connections there between population growth and sustainable development. So there are chapters on, well, there's a general chapter on population and the environment, and then there are two that look more specifically at issues of population growth and climate change, and another one on sustainable agriculture and food systems in the context of a growing population. So we definitely tried to frame this report around the sustainable development goals and make as many connections to that line of thinking as we could. And I think that's one strength of the report.
Well, we have a couple of websites. I'll just mention them now before I forget them, but our viewers can go to the general website at www.un.org for more information on a variety of programs of the UN. But on your report, we've got a lengthy website here. I won't go through the whole thing, but we will put it in the lower thirds so that our viewers can jot it down, and would definitely encourage our viewers to take a look at this very interesting report. John, you were talking about the health of the populations around the world and that type of thing, and brings into healthcare into mind. But I'm thinking, how important is it for reproductive healthcare for people in developed and developing countries?
Reproductive healthcare, well, of course, it's very important. Maternal mortality is one of the leading causes of death among women in that age range in many countries, and most of those deaths are preventable if appropriate care is available. But that's only kind of the tip of the iceberg, you might say, the actual deaths that occur. But then there's the health of the mother and the health of the children as well that can be compromised if adequate access to reproductive health care is not available. So there's one aspect which is just the health of the mothers and their children. But then another aspect is this issue of population growth. That I don't think we should invest in family planning just because we're trying to control population growth. But I think we should invest in family planning and reproductive health care because it improves the health of the population, and it keeps the mothers and their children healthier, and it means that the next generation will be more productive. There will be all kinds of positive aspects of that. But a secondary impact is that this tends to then, as family planning is more available, people tend to reduce their family size, and that also helps to bring down the growth of the human population.
And study after study shows that that is definitely the case. Anytime you have that situation, the family benefits, community benefits, the country benefits, and it's to everyone's advantage to do that, especially the health of the mother benefits quite a bit. So it's important to focus on that. You mentioned earlier, and this is something that I think is so important and so often it gets overlooked. You mentioned how really higher income, or not to quote you directly, but indirectly, I think you said higher incomes contribute more to environmental degradation than population growth. So often we hear folks saying, demographers and what have you, saying we need to reduce the population. We're at 7.8 billion now. We need to go down to 3 billion or whatever. But there's an argument to be made in the other direction. It's not the numbers, it's the per capita growth. It's how you spend your money and what you spend it on. Is it not?
Well, yes, I think it's very clear that we need to think of it in terms of what's the per capita impact on the environment. And that's partly a function of income, but it's also a function of the choices that are made about how to spend the income. So, as incomes go up, people tend to spend their money in ways that are more environmentally damaging. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but that has been the case. And the total consumption and total economic activity of the human population goes up partly as a function of population size, that's correct, but it also grows and has grown as a function of per capita activities. And in fact, if you look historically, the increase in the per capita impact on the environment has been greater than the increase in the size of the human population. The environmental damage that we do today, if you look back historically and say, how did that come about? It came about first and foremost because individual human beings started having much greater impact on the environment. And then also the number of those human beings has increased. But by far the larger factor is the former, the activities on a per capita basis. And as we look forward into the future and we think about what are policies that can plausibly help us in this situation, there are many more opportunities to intervene on the side of reducing per capita consumption, per capita impacts on the environment, as opposed to trying to reduce human numbers. It's very difficult, really, to change human population trends very significantly. A lot of the growth is built in to the current age structure of the population. We have a lot of young people in the world, a lot of people who are of reproductive age, and that will continue. And as long as they're around, I mean, you can't assume that they're going to have zero babies. Of course, they have desires to form a family, and I don't think anybody's proposing to try and stop that. And so there's a certain almost inevitability of the future population growth, and proposals to solve the global environmental problems by reducing the human population significantly, below what it is today or below what is projected by the UN. In my view, those just simply aren't plausible proposals, and we should focus instead on achieving a more sustainable lifestyle and reducing the per capita impacts on the environment rather than trying to control the number of people. Many studies have backed that up when they look at what policy options there are and what could plausibly happen. All the IPCC studies confirm this, that the future trajectories of population that are plausible are much more narrow than the possible trajectories in consumption, various aspects of consumption, and what the impact per person on the environment might be in the future.
That is so critical. You were talking a minute ago about the per capita consumption and that type of thing. What are some of the suggestions as to how we could help reduce that? Did you get into that in your report, or did you comment on any of those? I mean, there are probably a multitude of them out there, I would imagine.
Yeah, I'm not such a specialist in this area. There are various approaches to improve the way that the economy functions so that has less impact. If you take food, for example, a couple of concrete issues that people emphasize are the issues of food waste. In terms of what individuals can do to contribute, the food system is a major contributor to global greenhouse gases, contributing about a quarter of the total. It comes from the food system, from farm to table. And two big things that individual consumers, where they can contribute, is one, reduce waste, because an enormous quantity of food is wasted every year. And secondly, shift one's diet toward a less meat-intensive diet, in particular, less red meat. That this on its own can have an enormous impact on, if it's done globally, obviously, one person won't make the difference. But if there's a shift globally in human food consumption toward plant-based proteins and much less reliance on animal-based proteins, especially those from ruminant animals, that would have a very important impact on the environment.
There will definitely have to be a transformation in our food supply systems, and we're going to have to rethink how we do things. And of course, we can all try to reduce waste of food. That's very easily done. And it's just mind-boggling when you see some of the articles in the newspapers or reports on how many millions of tons of food are wasted perhaps every day around the world. I'm not sure, but it's a huge amount. Without a doubt. John, before we run out of time, we were talking about climate change indirectly. We're talking about the degradation of the environment. The developing countries are the ones who are really suffering the most from the initial effects of climate change we've seen up to this point. We see islands in the Western Pacific that have the potential of going under, or in the Indian Ocean. But still, the developed countries are the ones who created most of it, but the developing countries are receiving the brunt of the problem. How can, or will not, the developed countries have to assist the developing countries in dealing with this problem?
Well, I think if we're going to be successful, yes, they will have to assist the developing world to find solutions that are effective. It's absolutely true. As a matter of equity, in thinking about this problem, we have to keep in mind that it's the relatively rich countries that have been consuming at very high levels for many decades, and that that's where the problem comes from. The contribution of poor countries to the current situation is almost negligible. And within countries, we see the same difference between the people with the highest incomes and the lowest. Most of the consumption, most of these environmental impacts are coming from a relatively small segment of the human population living in developed countries and the higher income peoples within those countries. So, the fact that those countries are growing slowly now, and yet the poorer countries that haven't contributed to this problem are growing very rapidly. Well, you've got to be aware of that fact when you think about how to resolve this issue. The reality is that for many developing countries today, especially low income, lower middle income countries, they need to grow their economies massively in order to achieve the SDGs, say the human-focused SDGs, the ones about education, healthcare, reducing poverty and reducing hunger, that require and producing decent jobs for the population. This requires economic growth, and so growth needs to happen in those countries. And what the richer countries can do is help to guide those countries and to provide technologies that are available that can ensure that growth happens without contributing further damage to the environment. So many of the green technologies that have been developed and that are available, if they were adopted as developing countries are developing and building their economies, that would be very wise, because it could, if they could leapfrog over the old technologies into new technologies, but they won't do that probably on their own. And that's where I think there's really a responsibility of the richer countries to assist the developing world to make that leapfrog over the old technologies to newer ones, the greener ones that will be less environmentally damaging in the future.
John, that's a perfect way to close the program, and that summed it up very nicely. And again, I would encourage all of our viewers to get a copy or to go online and read the report, Global Population Growth and Sustainable Development. But this topic is so important, and it affects all 7.8 billion people on the planet. John Wilmoth, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.